The first sign that something was terribly wrong came from a woman who refused to die quietly. In March of 2018, 91-year-old Mary Brooks was alone in her apartment at a senior living community in Dallas, Texas, when a man entered her home. Residents were used to seeing workers, caregivers, and visitors moving through the building, so an unfamiliar face did not immediately seem alarming. But this man was not there to help her. According to investigators, he attempted to smother her with a pillow while searching for jewelry and valuables. Mary fought back with everything she had. She screamed, struggled, and managed to survive long enough for help to arrive. Her attacker fled the scene, leaving behind more than a traumatized victim. He left behind the first real opportunity investigators had to stop a killer who had already been operating for years. Police quickly identified a suspicious vehicle leaving the area and traced it to a man named Billy Chemirmir. When officers approached him, they found jewelry, cash, and personal belongings that appeared to belong to elderly women. At first, detectives believed they were dealing with a violent robbery suspect targeting senior citizens. What they did not yet realize was that they had likely stumbled onto one of the deadliest serial murder investigations in recent Texas history. If you enjoy carefully researched, true crime stories that focus on the investigation and the victims rather than glorifying the offender, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. These real cases remind us that some of the most dangerous predators hide behind ordinary appearances. Billy Chemirmir was born in Kenya and later moved to the United States. He eventually settled in the Dallas area, where he worked various jobs, including positions that brought him into contact with residential communities. He was described by some acquaintances as quiet and unremarkable. Nothing about his public image suggested that authorities would one day accuse him of murdering numerous elderly women. After his arrest in the attack on Mary Brooks, detectives began examining the items recovered from his vehicle. Among them were pieces of jewelry linked to women who had recently died under circumstances that had not initially been treated as homicides. That discovery changed everything. Investigators started reviewing cases involving elderly women who had died unexpectedly in independent living and assisted living communities across Dallas and nearby suburbs. Many of the deaths had been attributed to natural causes because the victims were advanced in age and had underlying health conditions. In some cases, family members had noticed missing jewelry or other valuables, but the deaths themselves had not appeared suspicious enough to trigger full homicide investigations. Now detectives were seeing a pattern: elderly women living alone, no signs of forced entry, jewelry missing after death, and a suspect who possessed property belonging to multiple victims. As police dug deeper, the timeline became increasingly alarming. One of the women whose belongings were connected to Chemirmir was 81-year-old Lou Thai Harris. She had been found dead in her apartment in 2018. Initially, her death did not receive the level of scrutiny that a younger victim's might have received, but when her jewelry turned up in Chemirmir's possession, investigators began to suspect that she had been murdered. Another case involved 92-year-old Doris Gleason, who was found dead in her apartment at a senior living community in Plano, Texas. Family members had noticed that valuable jewelry was missing, yet there was little evidence of a struggle. To relatives, something about the situation never felt right. They would later learn that their instincts had been justified. One by one, additional cases began surfacing. The more detectives investigated, the more they realized they were not looking at isolated incidents. They were looking at a predator who appeared to have specifically targeted elderly women living in residential communities where deaths were sadly not uncommon. The alleged method was chilling in its simplicity. Chemirmir was accused of entering the apartments of elderly women, often by exploiting the relatively open nature of senior living facilities. Once inside, investigators believed he smothered the victims, frequently using pillows, before stealing jewelry, cash, and other valuables. Because smothering can leave limited obvious evidence, especially in elderly victims with existing medical conditions, many of the deaths had not immediately raised suspicion. That realization devastated families. Imagine learning that a loved one whose death had been accepted as a natural passing may actually have been murdered. Imagine attending a funeral, grieving what you believed was an unfortunate but peaceful death, only to discover months or years later that someone had deliberately ended that person's life. As news of the investigation spread, more families contacted authorities. Detectives reopened old cases, reviewed autopsy findings, examined surveillance footage from senior communities, and traced stolen jewelry that had been sold to pawnshops and dealers. The investigation grew rapidly. What began as a single attempted murder case was evolving into a sprawling serial homicide investigation involving multiple police departments across the Dallas metropolitan area. One of the most important aspects of the case was the surviving witness. Mary Brooks could describe her attacker. Her survival provided investigators with a direct connection between Chemirmir and the pattern of crimes. Without her resistance, many investigators believed the deaths might have continued to be treated as unrelated natural causes for much longer. Her courage may have saved other lives. As prosecutors prepared their case, the number of alleged victims continued to rise. Authorities eventually linked Chemirmir to the deaths of more than a dozen elderly women, making him one of the most prolific suspected serial killers in Texas history. The victims ranged in age from their 70s to their 90s. Many were widows. Many lived alone. Their vulnerability was not a coincidence. It appeared to be the very reason they were targeted. For the communities affected, the sense of betrayal was profound. Senior living facilities are supposed to provide safety, support, and peace of mind for elderly residents and their families. Instead, investigators alleged that a killer had been moving through those communities almost unnoticed. As detectives continued building the case, they uncovered evidence that would lead to multiple murder charges and a courtroom battle that would force the public to confront a disturbing question: how many elderly deaths had been overlooked simply because the victims were old? That question haunted investigators as they continued reopening cases across the Dallas area. Every file represented an elderly woman who had died alone, often in a place that was supposed to provide comfort and security. Detectives began comparing medical records, autopsy reports, witness statements, and surveillance footage from multiple senior living communities. The similarities were impossible to ignore. In case after case, jewelry had disappeared shortly before or immediately after the victim's death. Family members often remembered noticing missing rings, necklaces, or purses, but because their loved ones were elderly, those details had not always been viewed as evidence of homicide. Now those missing valuables became some of the strongest links connecting the cases. Police also discovered that Chemirmir had been selling jewelry to pawn shops and dealers throughout the Dallas area. Records from those transactions helped investigators trace stolen items back to specific victims. What initially appeared to be ordinary secondhand sales became a trail of evidence stretching across several years. As the investigation expanded, prosecutors filed multiple capital murder charges against Chemirmir. The allegations were staggering. Authorities believed he had targeted elderly women in at least 4 different senior living communities and private residences across Dallas, Plano, Frisco, and other nearby cities. For the victims' families, the legal process was emotionally overwhelming. Many had already endured the pain of losing a parent or grandparent. Now they were forced to relive those losses while learning disturbing details about how their loved ones may have died. One daughter described the horror of realizing that her mother's final moments were likely filled with fear and confusion rather than the peaceful passing she had imagined. Another family spoke about the guilt they felt for not questioning the original conclusions more aggressively. Detectives repeatedly emphasized that the responsibility belonged solely to the killer, but those feelings of regret were difficult for many relatives to escape. If you're finding this story compelling, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps more people discover these real cases and ensures the victims' stories are not forgotten. In 2021, Chemirmir went on trial for the murder of 81-year-old Lou Thee Harris. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that her jewelry had been found in his possession shortly after her death. They argued that he had entered her apartment, smothered her, and stolen her valuables before leaving the scene unnoticed. The trial revealed just how methodical the investigation had become. Detectives testified about the recovered jewelry, surveillance evidence, phone records, and the broader pattern linking Chemirmir to numerous elderly victims. Jurors also heard about the surviving victim, Mary Brooks, whose testimony helped establish the violent nature of the crimes. After deliberating, the jury found Billy Chemirmir guilty of capital murder. Because prosecutors had not sought the death penalty in that case, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For many families, the verdict brought relief, but not closure. One conviction could not account for all the women investigators believed he had killed. A second trial followed in 2022, this time involving the murder of 87-year-old Mary Brooks' neighbor, another elderly victim linked to the growing investigation. Once again, prosecutors presented evidence connecting Chemirmir to the death through stolen property and the established pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly women. The second jury also returned a guilty verdict, resulting in another life without parole sentence. By that point, authorities had publicly linked Chemirmir to 22 deaths, though he was not tried for every case. Prosecutors ultimately decided not to pursue additional trials after securing multiple life sentences, reasoning that further proceedings would place enormous emotional strain on the victims' families without changing the fact that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. That decision was controversial. Some relatives wanted every victim's case heard in court. They felt that each woman deserved an individual acknowledgement of what had happened to her. Others accepted the practical reality that repeated trials could take years and force families to endure painful testimony over and over again. Beyond the courtroom, the case triggered serious discussions about how deaths in elderly populations are investigated. Medical experts and law enforcement officials examined whether certain warning signs had been overlooked. Smothering can be extremely difficult to detect during autopsies, particularly when victims are very old or have significant health problems. The Chemirmir investigation exposed how easily a determined killer could exploit those challenges. Senior living facilities across Texas reviewed their security procedures. Many communities increased surveillance, tightened visitor access, improved staff training, and encouraged families to report missing valuables immediately, even when a resident's death initially appeared natural. Perhaps the most powerful legacy of the case is the reminder that elderly victims deserve the same investigative attention as anyone else. Age should never make a suspicious death seem less important. The women linked to Chemirmir were not simply elderly residents in nursing communities. They were mothers, grandmothers, neighbors, teachers, church members, and friends. They had lived long, full lives. They had raised families, survived hardships, celebrated milestones, and built relationships that mattered deeply to the people around them. Their stories deserve to be told. Billy Chemirmir remained in prison serving his life sentences, but the full truth of how many women he killed may never be known with complete certainty. Some cases lacked sufficient evidence for prosecution, and the absence of definitive forensic proof in several deaths means lingering questions may remain forever. What is certain is that a predator was able to operate for years by targeting people society too often overlooks: the very elderly, the widowed, and those living alone. And what ultimately stopped him was not advanced technology or a dramatic police breakthrough. It was the courage of a 91-year-old woman who fought back when a killer tried to silence her. Mary Brooks survived long enough to tell investigators what happened. Her resistance transformed a suspected robbery into the unraveling of a serial murder investigation that may have saved countless future victims. In the end, this case is not only a story about evil, it is a story about persistence, about families who refused to ignore their doubts, about detectives who kept digging through old files, and about one elderly woman whose determination exposed a killer hiding in plain sight. Because sometimes the difference between a forgotten suspicion and the truth is a single survivor who refuses to let the darkness win. One of the hardest things to understand about the Billy Chemirmir case is how ordinary everything looked from the outside. The hallways were quiet. The apartments were tidy. The victims were elderly women who often lived independently, managed their own routines, and spoke regularly with family members. When they died, there was usually no shattered window, no obvious weapon, no dramatic crime scene that immediately screamed murder. That normal appearance became the killer's greatest protection. Investigators later believed that Chemirmir understood something deeply disturbing. Society often expects elderly people to die unexpectedly. A heart condition, a stroke, complications from age. Those explanations can seem tragically believable. In many of the cases, that assumption delayed the realization that something far more sinister had happened. As journalists began interviewing the victims' families, a heartbreaking pattern emerged. Several relatives said they had noticed missing jewelry almost immediately after their loved one's death. A wedding ring that was always worn, a necklace passed down through generations, a purse containing cash and personal items that could not be found anywhere in the apartment. At the time, some families wondered whether the items had simply been misplaced during the confusion that follows a death. Others suspected theft, but had no reason to believe murder was involved. Looking back, those missing valuables became chilling clues. Detectives eventually connected stolen jewelry from multiple victims to Chemirmir through pawn transactions and recovered property. Each recovered ring or necklace was more than evidence. It was a silent witness pointing back to a woman whose death deserved a second look. The emotional toll on investigators was enormous. Homicide detectives are trained to handle violent crime, but this case involved repeatedly revisiting the deaths of women who had already been mourned and buried. Officers had to contact families and explain that they were reopening investigations that everyone believed were finished. Imagine receiving that phone call years after losing your mother. Imagine hearing that police now believe her death may not have been natural after all. For some families, the news reopened wounds that had barely healed. Funerals had been held, estates had been settled, personal belongings had been distributed among children and grandchildren. The possibility that a murder had been present during their loved one's final moments changed the meaning of everything they thought they knew. The case also sparked national attention because of the age of the victims. Many people were shocked that someone could allegedly target women in their 80s and 90s with such calculated cruelty. These were individuals who had survived wars, economic hardships, personal losses, and decades of life's challenges, only to become victims when they were at their most vulnerable. As the legal proceedings continued, prosecutors emphasized that the crimes were not random acts of violence. They argued that Chemirmir specifically sought out elderly women living alone because they were less likely to be able to physically resist him and because their deaths were less likely to trigger immediate homicide investigations. That allegation made the case especially disturbing. This was not simply murder. It was the exploitation of vulnerability itself. Before we finish, if you've stayed with this documentary until this point, let me know in the comments which true crime case you'd like to see covered next. Your suggestions help shape future investigations and documentaries on this channel. In a final reflection, the Billy Chemirmir investigation exposed both the fragility and the resilience of the people involved. It exposed how easily vulnerable individuals can be overlooked. It exposed weaknesses in systems designed to protect the elderly, but it also revealed extraordinary resilience from families who refused to ignore their suspicions, from detectives who painstakingly reconstructed years of evidence, and from a 91-year-old survivor whose courage changed the course of the entire investigation. Mary Brooks could easily have become another unexplained death. Instead, she fought back. Her survival forced authorities to look closer, and because they looked closer, dozens of families finally received answers that had been hidden for years. Billy Chemirmir died in prison in 2023 after being killed by another inmate, bringing an abrupt end to the life of a man accused of one of the most extensive serial killing sprees involving elderly victims in modern American history. His death meant that many unanswered questions would likely remain unanswered forever. But the women linked to his crimes should not be remembered only for how they died. They should be remembered for how they lived, for the families they raised, for the communities they helped build, for the decades of memories they created long before their names appeared in headlines. In the end, the most important lesson from this case is painfully simple. Every suspicious death deserves careful attention, regardless of the victim's age. Every missing piece of evidence matters. And every victim, no matter how old, deserves to have their story heard, their dignity protected, and their memory remembered long after the headlines fade away.